Today, we are honored to be here with Dr. Michelle McMacken. Dr. Michelle McMacken is a board-certified internal medicine physician and an assistant professor of medicine at the NYU School of Medicine. She's an honors graduate of Yale University and Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. She has more than 10 years of experience practicing primary care, directing a medical weight loss program, and teaching doctors in training at Bellevue Hospital Center in New York City. Dr. McMacken has written articles for Forks Over Knives, including one called 7 Things That Happen to You When You Stop Eating Meat, that has been shared more than 250,000 times. So thanks for being with us here today, Dr. McMacken.
Oh, it's great to be here, guys. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, we consider you to be one of our experts here on the causes of diabetes and, what foods create diabetes, what foods can actually reverse the diabetic condition. So we're going to get into a lot of detail here today about the specifics about, what is causing insulin resistance and beyond. So first question for you today here is, as you know, there's a lot of confusion about sugar. Okay. Yes. Sugar is, a lot of people say, well, sugar is the cause of diabetes. And other people say things like sugar doesn't cause diabetes, right? What makes it even more confusing is that if sugar truly did not cause diabetes, then why is it that when millions of people stop eating sugar and minimize or eliminate their intake of sugar-sweetened beverages and refined sugars, they see a massive improvement in their blood glucose values? So can you just kind of help us clear up this confusion about whether sugar is actually the cause of diabetes or whether it's not actually causation?
Yeah, I love that you started with this question because you're absolutely right. There is so much confusion about it. Doctors are confused, patients are confused, the general public is confused. And I think, there's a good reason for that, and that's because the science is a little confusing. So the first thing I want to sort of sort out and define is that when we say the word sugar, we should really be distinguishing between sugar in our food and sugar in our blood. Okay, so sugar that's in our food, I'm going to talk about in a moment. Now, sugar in our blood, we need. So when food is broken down into different types of sugars in the blood, namely glucose, that's a great source of energy for all the cells of our body, particularly for our brain. And so we need sugar in our blood. That's what we live on. Now, sugar in our food is a different story, however, and there are different types of foods that have sugar. There are natural sugars, there are added sugars, and that's sort of where the confusion begins. So when we talk about added sugars in the diet and how do they play a role in diabetes? So as most people know, when people have diabetes, they tend to have too much sugar in their bloodstream. So when they check their blood sugar or it's measured in a blood test, the sugar comes back high. And so that can be a consequence of something that's going wrong inside the body, inside the cells, which I'll talk about. But it can also be a consequence of eating too much sugar, because when you eat a lot of sugar, there's more sugar in your blood if things aren't working well. Now, the foods that have added sugar in them, so in the forms of high fructose corn syrup, which is added to a lot of sugar-sweetened beverages. It's also in a lot of hidden places in our diets. Foods like sucrose, which is table sugar, and there's lots of different names of sugar. So there's agave, there's maple syrup, there's honey. There's all these ways that we can get sugar added in our diet. What we do know about those is the evidence, what the science really shows is 2 things. Sugar in the form of sugar-sweetened beverages, so beverages that taste sweet because they have sugary things added to them. Those are directly correlated with the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. And that's over many, many studies that we know that sugar-sweetened beverages do increase the risk of diabetes. And that's a correlational study, meaning that we see there's a link there. We don't completely understand why that might be, but we know there is a link. There is actually a little bit less of a link when it comes to other forms of added sugar in the diet, but it's important to recognize that there is a link there. It may be because that when we eat or drink sugar-sweetened beverages, we tend to eat other unhealthy foods with it. So for example, a lot of people might sit down and have a sugary soda together with a hamburger. And so those two things are hard to separate when we know that maybe hamburgers also cause diabetes, and we can probably talk about that later. Now, I do think it's important to distinguish between these added sugars and the natural sugars, because when we hear the word fructose, most people think about fruit. And so what I'm talking about when I say high fructose corn syrup or added sugars is not fruit. And actually there is a direct link between taking in pure fructose, so isolated fructose, which we can get in the form of high fructose corn syrup or other added sugars, table sugar, all the other types of sugar that are out there. When we take that in, it goes straight to our livers, and our livers tend to metabolize that in a way that causes the liver to release a lot of fatty acids into the blood. The liver also tends to build up fat within its cells when we eat isolated fructose. And so what happens there is that when the liver cells tend to build up fat, and when the liver puts more fat in the blood, we become more resistant to insulin. And so in that way, there is a link between sugar and diabetes. But I want to make it very clear that we're talking about added sugars in the diet, and we're not talking about the fructose that comes together with fiber and other nutrients in whole fruit, because it does not have that same effect when we eat fruit on its own as a whole food. Long-winded answer.
Yeah, no, that was a great answer. So, I mean, just to make it clear here, can people with diabetes eat fruit?
They can absolutely eat fruit. And not only can they eat fruit, they should eat fruit. And I'm going to give you an answer based on science, which is what I always try to do. So two big studies that everybody should be aware of. One is a study looking at North American populations of people and comparing people who ate more fruit to people who ate less fruit. And what they found is that people who ate more fruit did not have a higher risk of getting type 2 diabetes. In fact, certain fruits were actually protective in that study and lowered the risk of getting diabetes. And those fruits were grapes and apples, and as well as blueberries. So just, again, a correlational study, but did not show that fruit caused diabetes. Now, in that study, drinking fruit juice did increase the risk. And that's because, of course, when you're drinking fruit juice, even if you're making it at home and it's 100% fruit juice, you're separating the sugar in the fruit from the fiber. And that has downstream effects, which I can talk about maybe later. Now, another big study that everybody should be aware about, which was so cool. This was a study of 500,000 people in China. And this got published earlier this year. They followed these folks for about 7 years. Now, of the folks that did not have type 2 diabetes at the start of the study, what they found is just eating one piece of fruit a day. Imagine, that's not very much. One piece of fruit a day. Robbie, I know you couldn't do that. Those guys lowered their risk of getting type 2 diabetes by 12%, just by eating one piece of fruit a day. So that's point number one. The other really cool thing about that study was then they looked at people who already had diabetes, type 2, at the start of that study. And what they found is that if those guys eating a piece of fruit 3 times a week, that's even less, one piece of fruit 3 times a week, lowered the risk of dying of anything by 17%.
Wow.
So imagine, like, if we had a pill that did that, everybody with type 2 diabetes would be on it, right? So, but that was a piece of fruit 3 times a week. Now, that same piece of fruit 3 times a week also was shown to decrease the risk of complications of diabetes, like heart attacks, strokes, kidney disease, nerve damage, by up to 28%. So I think it's actually not scientifically sound to tell people with diabetes not to eat fruit. I think the evidence shows that they should eat fruit. They can and should.
Okay,
awesome.
let me play devil's advocate here for a second, because I know the experience of most people living with either prediabetes or type 2 diabetes is this. You tell them, okay, hey, it's okay. You can eat some fruit, whether it's 1 piece or 2 pieces or 5 pieces of fruit per day. And they do. So they put a banana into their mouth, and then an hour later they check their blood glucose and they're at a 250. Why is that the case? What's happening here?
Right. So that's a great question. And actually, that's what my patients say to me too when they have type 2 diabetes and I tell them to eat fruit. They're like, why, doctor, why would you tell me to eat fruit? Every time I eat fruit, my sugar goes really high. So obviously that's not good. So what I tell them is this. it's not the fruit's fault per se that your body can't handle the sugar in the fruit. The sugar in the fruit is not, when it's eaten in the form of a whole fruit rather than juice or added sugars, that's actually a problem of insulin not working properly. So in people whose insulin works properly or who are making enough insulin, you basically eat the piece of fruit and what's supposed to happen happens. Your insulin helps the sugar from that fruit get into the cells where it can be used for energy, and all the vitamins and antioxidants in the fruit can benefit you. Now, what are the real problem? The real problem is that our insulin isn't working properly. So what are the types of things that cause us to be resistant to insulin? What are the reasons that our insulin would not work properly? And I can talk a little bit more now about that, but that's what I explain to my patients. So I tell them that basically there are a couple of reasons why our insulin wouldn't work properly. And when I say that, what I'm really saying is that insulin, as many of you may have heard, you can think of it as sort of like a key that opens a door to let sugar in your blood inside your cells, particularly inside your muscle cells, where it's very important. And when that lock is sort of jammed and the key doesn't work, the insulin doesn't work, then your sugar just builds up outside of the blood. And so for a long time, scientists have been trying to understand what would make that lock jam, what would make your insulin not work properly. And really the science on this tends to be a little complicated, but here's what we know so far. The first thing is that for a lot of people, carrying excess body weight tends to cause inflammation, which tends to keep the insulin from working properly. And so that's why for a lot of people who have, say, pre-diabetes or even type 2 diabetes, losing some weight, if they're carrying excess weight, can help a lot with the problem. But there's independent of your body weight, because I have lots of patients who have type 2 diabetes who actually are quite thin. And so it's not just a problem of carrying excess body weight, it's where we tend to have inflammation and tend to store fat in the body. So if you tend to store some fat inside your muscle cells and your liver cells, that tends to make your insulin not work very well. And that can be directly related to inflammation and stress at the level of those cells. And there are certain foods that tend to promote that problem, no matter how much you weigh. And so if I had to tell you, what is the number one food that tends to promote that problem? It's processed meat. Okay, and by processed meat, what I mean by that are any meat that's been smoked, cured, fermented, has added salt or added preservatives, like nitrates. What happens there is something about the collection of nutrients and chemicals in those foods tends to drive inflammation and tends to drive us to have more stress inside our cells. And then the insulin does not work properly. The lock is jammed. And so this is something that my patients find completely astounding. I found completely astounding when I learned it, because this is not something that's taught widely in medical schools, in doctor training programs, and this is not something people know much about. They think it's all related to sugar, when in reality, the food with the highest reported risk of causing or being linked to type 2 diabetes is processed meat. Beyond that, it's probably a tie in terms of in the science between red meats and sugar-sweetened beverages. So none of these things should really be a part of anyone's diet, because they're not healthy for us. They cause more inflammation. They cause our insulin not to work properly. We have a huge amount of evidence around the connection between animal protein in general and the development of diabetes. And that's because animal protein and the package that it comes in tends to make our insulin not work very well. And then when you go to eat a piece of fruit, when you're eating a diet that's rich in animal protein, red meat, and processed meat, then when you eat that fruit, your sugar is going to go up. But that's not the fruit's fault. That's the fact that your insulin's not working very well.
Okay, so here's a simple question for you. You mentioned at the very beginning of this interview that you said that sugar-sweetened beverages are related to, or they're correlated with, diabetes risk. You did not say the word causational. Mm-hmm. When it comes to eating processed meats and or red meat, are those foods causational in causing diabetes, or are they also correlated with diabetes?
Well, they're very highly correlated for sure. And we probably, in my opinion, have as much, if not more, research showing that correlation than we do between sugar. But again, I tend to not, I don't want people to pit sugar and meat, because we really shouldn't be eating either one of them in terms of, we don't have to necessarily choose between added sugars and processed meats. Now, when it comes to causation, that is a hard thing to show. I think that we have enough evidence now. We have such strong correlational studies, and we have strong studies showing reversal of insulin resistance with diets that don't contain meat, that I think you could make an argument that there's probably enough evidence for causation. But regardless, we have enough evidence to know now what's the best way to advise our patients and for us to eat to prevent and treat and improve, even reverse our diabetes in many cases.
Okay, so I'm glad we're talking about all this. And so one thing that gets really, really confusing is the fact that the people can eat fat-containing foods, high-fat foods, and in a lot of cases, it doesn't necessarily require insulin injections or stimulate a person's pancreas to secrete a lot of insulin. So people think that's good. So there's a lot of confusion. Why can somebody follow a very high-fat, ketogenic diet and see some of those benefits? Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, so I think this stems back to the fact that when you follow a diet that's very poor in or low in carbohydrates, of course you're naturally going to see a drop in your blood sugar, because carbohydrates are the main type of nutrient that promotes sugar in your blood. Now, we do know from many, many studies that fat is linked to the risk of getting insulin resistant and for your insulin not to work properly. But it's not necessarily all types of fat. We know the strongest link is for saturated fats, which tend to be primarily found in animal products, but are found in some, in smaller proportions in some plant foods. But they're primarily in animal products. And we also know that there's a link with trans fats, which are found in many processed foods. So when it comes to these ketogenic diets, what we see is that, first of all, a lot of people tend to lose weight up front, and that's because they tend to be, sometimes they're eating fewer calories. And so those two things alone, eating fewer calories and losing weight, will help a little bit with insulin resistance, depending on how much weight you're losing. But we don't have great data that then challenging someone like that with healthy carbohydrate-rich foods like oatmeal or fruit, that they'll be able to handle those foods the way they would have had they started out with a healthier diet that's based in those foods and naturally helps control insulin resistance. So the way I look at it is kind of like an artificial lowering of your of the signs of insulin resistance without necessarily getting to the root of the problem.
Okay, so this is great. So another thing that we see in the news a lot, that we read on the internet, and that people kind of in the diabetes world especially throw around, is they say, you need good fats. Let's eat good fats and not bad fats, right? Is there such thing as a good fat? Is there such thing as a bad fat? Like, why have we as human beings put these words in front of the word fat, and does it have any scientific relevance?
Yeah, so I think this is something I hear all the time too. I think that when it comes to these, first of all, as a society, we love to talk about nutrients instead of talking about foods themselves. And I think that creates a lot of confusion for people. And when I teach medical students and doctors in training, I always say, don't tell your patients, don't talk about carbs, fat, and protein with your patients, because it's going to be confusing. Carbohydrate could be a lentil or a lollipop, as Dr. David Katz always says, or fats could come from an unhealthy place, like a steak, or it could come from a healthier place like a walnut. So I do think it's very confusing when we use those terms, but you're right. People talk a lot about good and bad fats. I think that when it comes to diabetes, the data are pretty clear that, as I was saying, that I think that there are certain types of fats that are very, very harmful in the development of especially type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance. So we know, for example, that the saturated fats and the trans fats, which come from largely processed foods that are when hydrogenated oils are added, or when we have animal fats, those are directly correlated with the risk of type 2 diabetes and the development of insulin resistance. You can infuse saturated fat into the bloodstream through an IV and watch someone become insulin resistant in a matter of hours. We have those studies. Now, when it comes to sort of quote unquote good fats, I do think it's probably more important to look at where your fats are coming from in the diet, what are the sources, rather than the total amount, but to a point when it comes to diabetes. So if you're focusing on plant fats in their whole form, like avocados or nuts and seeds, we know that the outcomes associated with eating those foods are far greater, both in terms of preventing diabetes and certainly preventing complications of diabetes like heart disease and other illnesses. But I think that that's only to a point. So if you have a diet that studies have shown, if you have a diet that's say more than 37% fat, I know from one big study, then it was all a wash. So if you're eating a really high fat diet, you might, even if it's coming from quote unquote good fats, you might be starting to impair the way your insulin works.
That's really, really fascinating. So let's go down a little bit deeper. Is there a specific recommended macronutrient ratio of people with diabetes?
So, I think that it kind of, if you look at some of the guidelines, society guideline recommendations, they all say we don't have enough evidence to tell you a specific macronutrient ratio. And I understand why they say that. I think that the studies that we have on where there was dramatic improvements, the randomized trials where there's dramatic improvements in people who have type 2 diabetes, for example, these tended to be diets that were high in carbohydrate and lower than the average American diet in terms of protein and fat. But again, what I like to talk about is not so much the ratios of macronutrients as so much as the source. So where are you getting your carbs from? Are you getting them from whole foods? Or are you getting them from more refined foods? Where are you getting your protein from? Are you getting it from plant sources or are you getting it from animal sources? And then where are you getting your fat from? Again, animal sources and processed sources versus whole plant sources. That, to me, from my read of the science, is where you get the biggest bang for your buck. So rather than focusing on what's my ratio of carbs to protein, I think people should focus on the sources of foods in their diet. And that tends to add up to either a fully or mostly plant-based diet when you want to get the most bang for your buck.
Got it. That's great. So how does a plant-based diet help reverse insulin resistance and reverse the complications of diabetes, like kidney disease, heart disease, and nerve damage?
So plant-based diet is absolutely incredible on this front, and I'm going to tell you why. So the first thing is that when you're eating a plant-based diet that's based in whole foods, you tend to be eating a diet that is high in fiber and various kinds of fiber, particularly what we call cereal fibers, which is, by that I don't mean processed, Special K. What I'm talking about are fibers that come from whole grains, and there's something really unique about that type of fiber in terms of the way it works with our gut bacteria to help our insulin, to produce nutrients to help our insulin function better. So we know from big studies that actually whole grains are like oats or barley or brown rice are actually the food that tend to be most protective against the development of type 2 diabetes. So basically a diet that is a plant-based diet based on whole foods is going to be rich in fiber. It's going to help you not only because it helps your insulin be more sensitive, but it helps regulate your blood sugar, keeping you from having huge spikes in your blood sugar. It's also linked to people losing weight because, as everybody knows, when you eat a diet that's high in fiber and plant foods, you just feel more full. And it's a less calorie-dense diet. It's a more nutrient-dense and less calorie-dense diet. And so therefore, if you tend to carry excess weight, which puts you at risk of diabetes, then you tend to lose some weight, and that also helps with your diabetes. The other reason that a plant-based diet is so effective for preventing and treating diabetes is the antioxidants. So antioxidants are these really cool things that as much as a lot of people would like to get everything in a pill, you can buy them in a pill, but they don't really work in the form of a pill. These are molecules that tend to soak up some of the products of what we call oxidative stress inside our cells. So these molecules tend to kind of dampen down and diffuse the damage that we're all experiencing every day just by being alive and going through the normal processes in our bodies. And they tend to protect our DNA and protect our cells from inflammation. And when we eat more of these foods that contain antioxidants, it therefore translates into insulin working better, and of course, downstream, lower risks of cholesterol deposits in our blood vessels and heart disease, lower risk of cancer, lower risk of a lot of other conditions. So we've got fiber, we've got antioxidants, which are really only found in plant foods, and it's fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and beans. And then we have the way that your gut flora, your gut bacteria transform when you eat a plant-based diet. And this is an area that is really under a huge amount of research. And there's great papers that have been published looking at how we change the type of gut bacteria we have when we follow a plant-based diet, particularly long-term. And then that translates into overall reductions in our level of inflammation in the body and other things that tend to lead to lower rates of diabetes and better insulin function. Now, so there's all of those things about a plant-based diet that are so useful, but it's also important what you're not eating when you're eating a fully plant-based diet. So what you're not eating are foods like I mentioned before. You're not eating processed meats, you're not eating red meats, and you're not really eating any animal protein, hopefully, because all forms of animal protein have been linked to insulin resistance, and they have all also been linked to risk of cancer, as well as risk of heart disease. And even we have data that now just substituting some of your animal protein for a plant source reduces your risk of dying of anything. So imagine if you're not eating those sources of animal protein, what you could do for your risk of diabetes and reversal of diabetes. So you're also not eating, a lot of processed foods. And when you're eating a whole foods plant-based diet, you're not eating a lot of added sugar. So you kind of get the whole bang for your buck with a whole food plant-based diet.
You know, I'm actually glad to hear you talk about animal protein independent of saturated fat because, you know, to a certain extent, just like you were saying earlier, people talk about nutrients, right? We talk about fat or carbohydrate or protein or cholesterol, but we don't necessarily talk about, you know, foods and whole foods in particular. But when you're referring to an animal-based product, let's say it's bacon or whether it's just a piece of chicken, right? You know, in reality, you're getting a whole complex collection of components. And there's sort of the way that I like to think about it is there's sort of like three villains. There's saturated fat, there's animal protein, and there's cholesterol. And each one of them independently of the other can influence your risk for developing diabetes and insulin resistance. And just like you're saying here, you know, aside from the fat, the animal protein itself is correlated with an increased risk for diabetes.
Yeah, I think, you know, I use that analogy a lot too, but I have more villains than you have. So I add on, I do love to tell my patients you're getting your nutrients in a package. And so nobody is sitting down and eating just a bowl of protein. We're getting protein with a lot of other things with it. So two of the other villains, in addition to the ones that you mentioned, so you mentioned saturated fat, you mentioned cholesterol, you mentioned animal protein, which are indeed, the scientific research shows, are indeed villains. I would add heme iron, and people who, you know, my friends actually make fun of me because I talk about heme iron so much, but it's really a reflection of what the science shows about heme iron. So first of all, what is heme iron? What do I mean by that? So heme iron is quite simply iron that we're getting from an animal source. So as opposed to getting it from a plant source. So a lot of people say, oh, well, when you get iron from animal foods, I heard you absorb the iron better and so forth. And there is some truth to that. We do tend to absorb iron from animal foods better, but that actually tends to be a problem, believe it or not. Because when you look at body stores of iron, you can measure how much iron you have stored in your body. The more iron a person has stored in their body, the higher their risk of chronic diseases, especially heart disease and diabetes. And so in trying to unpack this, scientists have looked at what is it about heme iron that would cause chronic disease? Well, it has to do with the fact that this is a very inflammatory, sort of what we call a pro-oxidant molecule. And not only does it therefore impair the way insulin functions, it's actually also been thought to directly kill the cells that make insulin. And so for lots of reasons, some of these are, not very well understood, but what is very well understood is that when scientists stack up all the different nutrients in foods and look at which ones carry the highest risk of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, it's heme iron at the top of the pack. It's unbelievable. In fact, it goes way beyond just type 2 diabetes. There was a big study published earlier this year looking at the risk of dying of 9 different causes. They took 500,000 people, and what they found is that people eating more heme iron in the form of red meat and processed meat were more likely to die of 9 different causes of death. And they broke that right down to the fact of it being heme iron as well as the processing chemicals in the processed meat. So, but it was, even if you have unprocessed red meat, just the heme iron in that food. So, so that's a big villain when it comes to the risk of diabetes. And this is again, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so no, this is great. So we basically have saturated fat, cholesterol, animal protein, heme iron. What's the fifth?
So the fifth is something I like to call, it is called TMAO, which is short for trimethylamine N oxide, which is quite a mouthful. But what that is basically a byproduct of the metabolism of our food by our gut bacteria. So another thing I'm kind of obsessed with is the gut bacteria. You're probably figuring that out. But basically, when we eat certain foods, for example, when we eat eggs, or when we eat red meat, even when we eat fish, we take some of the nutrients in those foods like choline or L-carnitine, and our gut bacteria tend to transform that into substances that then get metabolized into that molecule TMAO. And what we know about TMAO is that it actually tends to promote heart disease. It sort of adds more cholesterol and destabilizes the cholesterol that's sitting inside the walls of your blood vessels. It also tends to promote insulin resistance. And so it's not just bad enough that you ate the saturated fat or the animal protein or the cholesterol or the heme iron in those foods. It was that it cooperates with your gut bacteria to make this fifth villain called TMAO. So it's kind of a double whammy. And the really cool thing is, as I was saying before, we know that people who follow plant-based diets, especially long-term, they don't have the same gut bacteria. So studies have shown that they don't have as many of the gut bacteria that help make TMAO in the first place. So that's another way in which you're getting a benefit when you eat a plant-based diet.
Yeah, and then just like you said, just to make sure everything's super clear here, TMAO is something that your body produces, correct? So you consume foods that are rich in, I believe it's choline and carnitine, and then as a result of that, the microbes in your gut manufacture TMA, which then gets further metabolized to TMAO. Is that right?
Exactly.
Perfect. Okay, so let's recap these villains. We got saturated fat, animal protein, cholesterol, heme iron, and then choline and carnitine, which then metabolize into TMAO, right? So, think about it as the metabolic quintuple whammy to a certain extent. And
and there's more.
And there's more, exactly right. Just like you said, we eat packages of nutrients, and these are just 5 packages that scientists have identified are harmful, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't others.
Right, exactly. I mean, we've got advanced glycation end products. I mean, we're getting into a lot of really long and big words and scientific words, but these are things that we know come in that animal product package, particularly in meat. And so that's why there's the research is so strong that when we get those foods out of our diet, it actually allows our body to heal itself in a way. It allows our body to become to have lower levels of inflammation, which then translates into better overall functioning, especially when it comes to the function of insulin.
I love it. Okay, so here's another question. Now let's kind of take it on a slightly different tangent here. You are a physician of internal medicine. And so I'd imagine in your practice, you probably see a lot of people with, pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and maybe even type 1 diabetes. Mm-hmm. And yet you're one of the strongest advocates that we know for integrating plant-based nutrition into your practice and by educating your patients about how to adopt a plant-based diet so that they can truly transform from the inside out. So there's a lot of physicians who are listening to this right now. There's a lot of people in the healthcare industry that are specifically looking about how they can use plant-based nutrition to actually start to educate their patients. So can you give the healthcare physicians, in this room, some information about how you do it and what are some strategies that actually work?
Yeah, sure. So, you're absolutely right that this is something I'm super passionate about. And it's mostly because until I started to learn about using food as medicine, and particularly a plant-based diet, I never saw the types of transformations that I see now in my patients. And I think it's really unfortunate that it took this long in my career for me to learn to leverage nutrition, and particularly a plant-based diet, which is one of the most incredible tools that we have to prevent and in many cases treat chronic disease. So the way I integrate it into my practice is that a few different things. I mean, the first is I have a very standard primary care practice of internal medicine. So I don't get a lot of time with patients. I'm sure many people listening to this can relate to the fact that things move very quickly. Sometimes the most you have with your patient is just a few minutes. And that's an unfortunate situation. But in the time that I have with each patient, the first thing I just want to, if nothing else, demonstrate to that patient how much I care about the food that they're eating. And so one of the ways to do that is to ask somebody what they ate yesterday. Or just walk me through a typical day. And if you have the ability to have your patient write that down when they're in the waiting room, have the form for them to fill out before they see you, that can save time. But if you don't, a lot of times I don't, I have the patient come into the room and we just talk about, what did you eat yesterday? And even if we don't have time to get a lot of mileage on that, it's the first step in me showing to them that what they eat matters. I do like to talk to people about how the food choices that they have are directly related to things that they care about and their chronic diseases. So whether that's they want to lose weight, or whether they have diabetes and want to come off of some medications, or their diabetes is very out of control and they want to get it in better control, or they want to prevent diabetes, or they're on blood pressure pills or cholesterol pills and they want to come off of those or not go on them in the first place. There's numerous reasons, cancer risk. And so I always pick something that's going to be really relevant to that person. And no matter what direction we go in, the science is strong that eating a plant-based diet is going to help them. Is it going to cure everything? Probably not, but it's pretty darn incredible. So I like to tell them about maximizing the foods that they already happen to like that come from plants. So a lot of people who are ready to make a huge change, that's fantastic. And I talk to them about ways that they can transition to a whole foods plant-based diet. And for the folks that are not necessarily ready to make a big change and want to do things more gradually, I do like to tell them where we're going. But the speed at which they get there is up to them. And so it's very useful to start with, I have a list that I give patients that I call superfoods. And it's, even though it's called superfoods, it doesn't contain like unusual food. It doesn't have acai or other things on there. It's just literally a list of whole plant foods. And I have people look through it and in different categories and tell me what foods they already like that are there. And we start figuring out how they're going to work that into meals. And so for someone that might look like, how can they crowd out the animal products and the processed foods out of their meals and do that one meal a day? Or how can they transform one meal a day into a completely plant-based meal? Or how can they just start making substitutions, foods that they already like, instead of having a chicken burrito, can they make that into a bean burrito or even a bean soup? And so you get the idea. So it's, for some people, small steps. For other people who are ready to make bigger changes, it's big transformations, and I help guide them on that. But the messaging is always the same, that food matters.
That's awesome. So for people who really decide, I'm going to do this, like they get the information, they buy in, they're ready to go, what is the number one challenge that they run into, and how do you help them overcome that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people face, it's probably a tie. So for people that don't know how to cook and really have not spent a lot of time cooking, that can be a big challenge. And so for someone like that, my recommendations might be different than for people who already know how to cook and have some facility with that. And again, not being a fantastic cook myself, I can relate to that. And so I want people to understand you don't have to be a gourmet chef to prepare a healthy meal, just some basic cooking skills. So that's a barrier. I would say that another barrier is people worry about what are their family members going to say, and how are their family and friends going to react to this change. Food, as everybody knows, can be a very social activity. Food's a huge part of tradition and culture in our family lives. And so people worry about, how is this going to translate when I start making changes? I don't want to cook a dinner for my family and a separate dinner for myself. And that's something that I think a lot of people do struggle with. And so one of my approaches to that is, if you have a significant other in your life who's going to be affected, bring them to the appointment. Let's talk about it together. And again, this doesn't have to be an overnight process, and usually is not an overnight process. For many people, this is a more gradual thing. And so we try to find ways in which we can get the whole family inspired. And so that's an issue. And I would say that really the third issue is some people bring up issues of cost and finances. And I love when people have the honesty to tell me that they're worried about that. That's a very real concern for a lot of people. I work with a lot of my patients are living at the poverty line or below. And yet I am here to tell you that patients, even in those circumstances, my patients have done this, have transformed to a whole foods plant-based diet. And there's a lot of great ways to do that on a budget. There's great websites to explain how to do that. I am never talking about buying fancy or expensive foods. There are ways to buy in bulk and so forth. And I know you guys go through a lot of this in your other webinars. But that can be a barrier for people. And I would say really the fourth thing is that people worry about how they're going to change their routine. And it feels overwhelming for them at the beginning. And so it does take some planning. And I like to tell them that you have a routine now. You may not know it, but you have a routine now. And yes, you're going to have to put some work in. You're going to have to invest to change that routine. But once you have a new routine, you have a new routine. And so at that point, it's not going to be necessarily that much more work than what you're doing now. And the payoffs, of course, are astounding.
Those are some really, really great tips. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for being with us today. We really, really appreciate it. And you're a hero. Your work is incredible. We love following what you do. I love following your Instagram stories. Michelle is putting out amazing information, like studies, and you're just doing amazing work. So thank you.
Thank you. You guys are awesome too.
One thing I also hope that your patients realize how lucky they are to be your patient, because we have a number of clients that are just clamoring to have a doctor who understands plant-based nutrition, or who at least is going to support their decision to become plant-based. And a lot of our clients actually get a little bit frustrated when, the conversation is about food and it's just about medication. So I truly do hope that your patients have at least an inkling of appreciation for what you're actually doing for them, because you're actually giving them a toolkit which they can use to actually transform from the inside out that, is invaluable.
Thanks you guys. That's very kind of you. And I do agree. We need more doctors who understand nutrition and who support people transitioning to a plant-based diet. And that's why I'm out there running a mile a minute, trying to do more teaching so that we can grow more doctors who are interested in this. So thank you. Thanks for all your work.